Hey guys, and welcome to this long-awaited updated guide. Since 4 months ago, where I posted the other guide, a lot has changed, both in the game and also my own philosophy on Swain. That is why it's time for a new guide, explaining how I play Swain today. You already know who I am, so I won't go much into detail, but I will be taking a look at the stuff I actually know about, which will be mostly Swain mid, but a lot can be applied to other roles as well. I won't dig into builds, runes and roles that I don't play, because I don't think I'm qualified for that. But this guide will only be explaining how I approach Swain. I also want this guide to be easy to follow, so every single Swain player can apply my thoughts on the game and hopefully win some LP. If you find my videos helpful, remember to subscribe and like. This will help the algorithm push out my videos, and it gives me great motivation. No more talking, let's get into the guide. I believe if you want to play a champion truly correct, you need to understand their identity. So I'll give you a quick explanation on how I view Swain. I don't believe Swain carries through damage. I think he has enough damage, and his damage can be really strong if he's ahead, but it's not what makes him truly powerful. What makes him truly powerful is his ability to create space, take attention and zone control. Swain is one of the best champions at taking the enemy's attention because of his ultimate and his CC from E and W. So I view Swain as a really durable battle mage that is extremely good at frontlining for your team, taking all the enemy's attention and creating space for your carries, and he brings a ton of utility. Nonetheless, his damage is still really strong, but I wouldn't build him for only damage, because I believe his champion identity lies somewhere else. Since he doesn't scale very good with AP, meaning it's way better for him to get a lot of haste, magic pen and durability. He is also one of the best debuffers in the game, and by debuffer I mean he's really good at applying effects to enemy team, such as Liandry's, Rylai's, Abyssal Mask, Frozen Heart, Anti-Heal, all because of his ultimate and how he's supposed to play teamfights. I hope this gave you some insight on how I view Swain. Now let's go take a look at the runes that I use. This rune page is in my opinion the best rune page for Swain right now in solo lanes. I wouldn't recommend Conqueror anymore, only in APC role. Summon Area and Scorch is simply just too broken in solo lanes, where you can constantly poke down your lane opponent. Conqueror doesn't really heal, and it takes time to stack, and it only gives 48 AP at level 18. That is why I believe for solo lanes it's way better to have Area as your keystone. This will give you way more early pressure, and you will actually be able to solo kill people, snowballing the game. This also ties into the reason that Swain is actually not a late game champion. He falls off late on the game, but he is insanely strong mid game. So you must do everything in your power to get to a mid game position where you are ahead. Summon Area and Scorch will help you tremendously, getting a good start to the game, transitioning into a successful mid game. Take Mana Flow Band. This will reduce your mana issues. You don't need Presence of Mind on Swain as long as you have Mana Flow Band. It actually doesn't give a lot of mana early game, and since once you get Lost Chapter or Catalyst, you won't have mana problems anyway. The one keystone variation I would recommend is Phase Rush. I would pick this keystone whenever my opponent is completely outranging me. So against stuff like Victor, Orianna, Syndra, Seraph, Ziggs, you get the point. It's also really good against ganking junglers, or against enemies with a lot of slows, like Cillian, Nasus, Tryndamere, Ashe, and Nivea. You, the player yourself, must evaluate if you think it's necessary to go Phase Rush before the game starts, depending on the enemy comp. Moving on to secondaries, I would recommend Conditioning and Overgrowth. They synergize extremely well with Swain's identity. There is one variation though, and that is Unflinching. Take this against team comps that has a lot of CC and slows. Then for shards, go Ability Haste, Magic Resist to Armor depending on matchup, and Scaling Health. You can swap Scaling Health to Armor Magic Resist. Let's say you're against double AP mid and jungle, so let's say Elise and Syndra. Then I would go double Magic Resist. On the other hand, let's say you're against Qiyana and Lee Sin, then consider double armor. The shards all depend on what you think is most valuable against the enemy team comp. So I can't give you one formula that will fit every game. It is up to you to make the decision. But the haste is mandatory. You will need this to harass more in lane with Qs. I never take Adaptive Force, always double defensive for the 2 remaining shards. I go this page every game with variation of course depending on enemy team comp. I hope this gave you a greater understanding of what runes I choose and why. Moving on to build paths. When building on Swain, there are two paths I recommend. The standard build and the Chinese super server build. I'll go over both and when to use them. This is the standard build, and you should pick this build when your team needs damage, meaning you already have enough frontline on your teammates. Then you opt for damage build, which is the standard build. You go Leandris into Rylai's, getting boots somewhere around here also. Then you go armor or magic resist item as third, depending on enemy team comp. So let's say they have 2 or more AP, you then go Abyssal third, but let's say they only have 1 AP, then you go Sonya's or Frozen Heart third, depending on enemy team again. Frozen Heart for example is really good against auto attackers, but Sonya's on the other hand is really good against assassins or champs with burst. And if they have 0 AP, then of course you skip Abyssal. Use common sense guys. So third, you get Abyssal if enemy team is heavy AP. On the other hand, if they are heavy AD, you get Sonya's or Frozen Heart. Fifth item, I would recommend going Gargoyles. This is an all around really good item and it's insanely strong on Swain. For boots, you should go Sork shoes almost every single game. But of course again guys, use common sense. If they have 5 auto attackers, you then of course go play the steel caps. Or if they have a lot of CC, then you of course go Merc Treads. Now moving on to the Chinese super server build. This is the build you go when you don't have a frontline. So you have pure damage on your team. At the end of the build section, I'll show some examples, so no worries. This build specializes way harder in frontlining for your team and creating space. It also has an absurd amount of ability haste, meaning you dish out tons of utility. And you won't have mana problems, like you will if you go tank mythics like Jackshaw or Radiant. Meaning you can assert way more pressure in the side lanes, which is a really important skill to have when playing mid or top lane. The build has cheaper items than the standard build, and a common misconception is that Rod of Ages is only good later in the game, but it is actually really strong the moment you buy it, because you become incredibly tanky with the Eternity passive plus the 400 HP standard roar gives you, which will turn many early fights. So you can snowball as fast as possible and end the game before it goes too late. The build is Rod of Ages, Cosmic Drive and Lucidity boots. And again of course, the boots can vary depending on enemy team comp. But the standard boots with Super Server build is Lucidity boots. They are really cheap early spike and they compensate for Rod of Ages having no ability haste. Again with this build, on third or fourth item you either pick armor or magic resist, Abyssal Mask or Frozen Heart, depending on enemy team comp. You usually don't go Sonya's with Super Server build, so try and skip that one. You don't want to be standing still in stasis, because you are so fast with Cosmic and Rod of Ages movement speed that you can just move around instead. You have so much ability haste that you can just constantly throw out E's and W's, providing a lot of CC for your team and being able to frontline with your big health bar and resistances combined with your high movement speed, which will help you going in and out of the fights if you're getting low HP. You don't have a stasis like the other build, so you need to be able to move out if your HP drops too low. This build is extremely tanky, while also having pretty high damage. Your damage is too high for enemy to ignore, and you are simply too durable to kill easily. A reason why ability haste also works really well with Swain is because when he's able to throw out more E's and W's, he actually gets a lot of heals from his passive, making it really hard to kill him. I'll now go over some examples on when your team has a frontline and when they don't, so it's maybe a little easier to understand what I mean. Here is a team comp I had in solo queue. What build do you think I went? The standard build you go when the team needs damage, or the Super Server build you go when your team needs a frontline? You have 5 seconds. The correct answer is the standard build, because you already have Maokai and Cassante that can frontline. What your team needs isn't more frontline, it needs damage. That is why you go the standard build here. Let's do one more. This is now your team. What build do you go? You have 5 seconds. If your answer was the Super Server build, you are correct. You choose which of the build paths you go depending on your composition, not the enemies. I think you're starting to get the point, and I hope this helps you deciding what build path to go. But Husum, what about my favorite item, Demonic Embrace? It is completely overrated. Don't build it. Swain has way better item options. Those I listed before in the builds. Demonic Embrace is way too expensive for the amount of stats it gives it. And the percent health damage burn is so weak. The Abyssal Mask passive outdamages Demonic every game. So Demonic in its current state is simply not worth building. You have way better options. And no, the AP is not worth it, since AP isn't a super good stat on Swain anyways. It's way better to get items with actual resistances at this point. I simply wish this item was better on ranged characters, because it could be so cool to go both Demonic and Liandris in one build for the maximum burn, but it's sadly so inefficient that you shouldn't go it. Until they maybe buff it, please Riot, I beg you. Another item I'd like to talk about is Spirit Visage. This item is also hugely overrated, and it is the standard MR item choice for a lot of Swain players actually. Because in theory it actually looks good on Swain because it gives more healing. But in reality, it's just outperformed by Abyssal Mask again. Abyssal Mask is simply just the most superior MR item you can ever get on Swain. You can maybe buy this item if they have a lot of magic damage on their team and you already bought Abyssal Mask. So you go double magic resist item, but that's about it. But I personally prefer Gargoyles if I need more magic resist other than Abyssal. Abyssal Mask simply just gives too many stats for the price. It's only 2400 gold for an item that can give up to 100 magic resist. How insanely broken is that? And also it gives 25 magic pen, increasing your own damage on a tank item. So Spirit Visage is very situational. I would only really build this item if I have double enchanter on team, because the extra healing and shielding on you also applies if your allies shield and heal you. Okay, the rant is over, let's move on to summoner spells. Swain mid has 3 different options to choose from. Flash Ghost, TP Ghost, Ignite Ghost. I value Ghost highly on Swain. It's really important to be able to stick onto people. And Ghost is one of the best summoner spells early game, because it gives you such a big mobility advantage, since people don't really have boots yet, and it's on a significantly shorter cooldown than Flash. And I personally think it's one of the best summoner spells in the entire game. On Swain I find it even more important than having Flash. I think you should mostly pick what you prefer, so if you cannot play without Flash, of course go Flash Ghost. It's also the best summoner spells if you're going to purely teamfight. But if you feel you are in scenarios where TP is very useful, example, you need to side lane more, or you're playing against stuff like Syndra or Orianna that will push you out of lane early, where you kinda need the TP back, then I would go TP Ghost. For top lane Swain, I always go TP Ghost, by the way. I would only go Ignite Ghost, but I feel like it will give me an actual chance to solo kill my opponent. Example, against Sylas it's very strong, because you also cut away his healing. Against other assassins, stuff like Akali, Kiana, it can also be picked, because it gives you a lot more kill pressure. But again, it's really hard to just give you one formula on when to pick what, because it depends on so many factors like enemy team comp and how your personal playstyle is. All these summoner spell combos work and you can climb with each of them. Find one of the combinations you're really comfortable with and just climb with that. It doesn't matter too much at the end of the day, it's how you play that's gonna win you the games, not magically having one summoner spell or the other. Now that we're talking about winning, let's move on to some of Swain's win cons and power spikes. Swain's first and noticeable power spike is when he either gets Lost Chapter or Catalyst, which happens around level 6, where he also gets his ultimate. At level 6, Swain is probably one of the strongest champions, because his ult is simply just so broken early game, because people do not have damage to burn through you. Especially if you have Lost Chapter or Catalyst, you are just a menace in the jungle fights or 2v2s, 3v3s, whatever. So you really need to try and look for fights at around level 6. You will usually just outclass anyone. Also at around level 11 and 16, when he gets more points in ultimate, it's also a really good time to fight, because the healing increases a lot. If you run my room page, at 12 minutes you also get a really big power spike, because that is when conditioning and overgrowth finishes, and you get a lot more health and resistances. But the most important part is to understand that Swain is a mid-game champion, meaning he is at his strongest at 2 items, when he finishes either Rylai's Liandris or Rod of Ages Cosmic. This is the point where you need to do something, so don't AFK at this point. You need to push your lead so you can end the game before everyone outscales you. You are one of the best 2 item champions in the game. That is also why it's important to have a good early game, so you can actually reach these 2 items consistently and before anyone else. That is why usually in melee matchups my win condition is just to dominate lane, and this way I will reach 2 items before anyone else, completely taking over the game. Against ranged champions it's a little harder, because you can't poke them reliably with Aerie like you can with melee champs. So in ranged lanes I'm more looking to join river fights where my opponent cannot join, so I arrive first. Ghost is really important for this reason, and especially level 6, just look to roam around with your jungler and get a lead that way. You do not have to solo kill your opponent to win lane. All you need to do, you can also just make good roams and impact through that. If you have struggled to gain a significant lead, and let's say you are a little behind, don't lose hope yet. Pray to God that bot lane wins. Since Swain is actually a really good peeler, and he works extremely well with a fed AD carry, because he can just walk in front of the carry, being the shield, create space, making sure the ADC can auto attack, and just peel with your utility, make sure nobody gets close to them. This is a thing I actually don't see enough Swains do. It's just to actually don't go in like a maniac, but staying with a carry, peeling them. This is very useful to do if you're not so fed that you can just run into everybody and kill all. Swain isn't really a combo champion, but he has a very few essential combos and mechanics you need to understand. Firstly, all his flash mechanics, if you decide to run flash. These are all used to reposition Swain's character, either getting close to them so your Q does more damage, catching them off guard, changing the direction of your E with a flash, locking people down with CC, or ult flashing so they cannot get away. All of these flash mechanics can be used very creatively, but this is only if you decide to run flash. Swain is also able to redirect the angle he pulls, so you can walk a little and for example pull them into tower. Now for the only real combo on Swain, if you want to guarantee hitting your W, you need to hit an E first, put a W behind it and pull them into it. This will guarantee your W unless they have like a fast dash, and this is the all-in combo when you want to go crazy. But apart from that, Swain isn't all that combo or mechanics heavy. He's more about making smart decisions in macro, movement and spacing. He is the Grand General after all, not the combo master. I'll give you a general idea how I approach laning versus a melee champ or laning versus a ranged champ. Against melee champs, you really need to push your ranged versus melee advantage. So start harassing already level 1. You also need to be the first guy to hit level 2, so you need to be hitting the wave simultaneously. You start queuing all these matchups and just queue them every time they walk up for CS. It's gonna do a lot of damage with Aerie and Scorch. Stack up 3 waves if possible and crash it under tower. Now it's time to put out a ward and harass the enemy under tower. At this point you can seriously injure melee champions, and the wave will now push back to you because it just bounced from tower. This is where I get most of my solo kills in the early game, since I can now also be just pulling a freeze just outside my tower, making sure his wave will never crash and I can just permanently harass him with Q every single time he walks up. In the early game, it's a really good idea to pull freezes on these melee champs. This will make you safe from ganks also, and it's gonna be so easy to deny CS and harass. I would advise to stop freezing at around level 7, 8 or 9 depending on the game, but it's usually just better to perma push and have mid prio and being able to roam, because now a lot of stuff is probably gonna happen around the map, so you need to be there to help. This is my general game plan when going into melee matchups. Let's dive into some of my thoughts when playing against ranged. Ranged is essentially Swain's counter. Swain is extremely good against the melee champs and will usually struggle against people that outrange him, stuff like Orianna and Syndra. That is why ranged lanes will usually be harder to play, so you kinda need to approach the lane differently. Try and still get prio to get level 2 first, so keep hitting the wave early. It's gonna be way harder to stack up 3 waves, but just stacking 2 wave and crashing it into the tower, giving you a timer to put out a ward is also fine, since these lanes are more based on who can push fast, so you can move. You're gonna encounter a lot of champs that can just perma hit the wave, so you need to fight back and keep the wave at least neutral, or best case scenario you just keep pushing the wave into their tower, making them completely stuck on the tower, meanwhile you can move around the map. These lanes are usually won through different means than just solo killing your opponent. It's fine to not interact too much with champs, like let's say you played against Seraph. It's gonna be really hard to solo kill anyways, so just going for perma push and looking for roams is gonna be a great option. You can out impact him in all early fights, and especially level 6 you should use your power spike to win a fight in river or bot lane by roaming. A lot of range lanes aren't as strong as you in the 2v2 or 3v3 or just roaming in general, so you really need to use this to your advantage. Other than that, I would say movement is really important in these range lanes, since you'll be needing to dodge skill shots so you can push out the wave, while in melee lanes spacing is extremely important, so you can keep the melee champs at a distance where they cannot attack you while you can attack them. I hope this part gave you some ideas on how you should approach a melee or range lane. This is at least how I look at it. Let's go take a look at what you should do in the mid and late game. There is no defining number when mid-game starts, but it should be around 14 minutes when the plates fall. All you need to know though is when one of the bot lane towers falls, either enemy or your own, it's your job to go down there. This is where side laning enters the picture. Tell your bot lane to go mid now. Mid lane is the safest lane, that is why bot lane should be in there in the mid game. If they refuse to listen and won't swap even after one of the tower falls, just report them for being an unskilled player. Now that you are finally down in bot lane and side laning, it is now your job to collect the waves. You're not a split pusher, you do not have to pressure their nexus or nexus towers. All you have to do is make sure you collect the gold and XP from the sides without losing the 1v1 to the opponent. So if he's stronger, just let him push the wave first and then collect the gold at a safe spot. It's important to not die. Mid game is very easy because you actually just do the same thing over and over. You go to the side lane and fix the wave. Make sure it's not close to your tower. After you push the wave, it's all about going mid lane and looking for fights afterwards. So it's simply just push sides, go and hover mid, look for fights. If enemy responds and pushes the side back to you again, simply go down there, collect the wave, and then run mid again, look for fights. Hover your team, try to be in all the team fights if possible, while collecting as much gold and XP as possible in the side lanes. This is one of the biggest reasons why you have low CS, because you are not farming after laning phase. You need to keep collecting gold and XP in the side lanes. So collect the wave and push it out past mid waves, and then go run to mid lane, looking for fight or defending your team. You will stumble upon scenarios where it is not worth to run to your team. If you can see the fight is already lost or you won't be able to make it in time, there's no reason to run down to a lost fight. Just keep staying inside, collecting even more resources, pressuring their towers. If you have Ghost and TP, you can just stay in side lane until a fight happens and then TP in for either a flank or just to front line for your team over an objective. If you don't have the luxury of TP, you need to be very aware of when a fight is about to happen. Sometimes you are not able to collect the wave because you can just see a fight will start very soon. For example, an important Drake is about to spawn in 5 seconds. Then you of course can't collect the wave and you have to run down and help your team. You need to have a lot of experience to play mid game, something I can't give you from this guide, because a lot of situations and scenarios can appear in mid game and I will not be able to explain all of them, so you can just follow this guide and you will just automatically play a perfect mid game. Mid game takes a lot of experience and you need to have played a lot of games to understand when to do what. But I hope my general knowledge gave you an idea on how to play Swain in the mid game. So keep hitting those sides and look to hover your team. Late game is played mostly the same way as mid game, but you need to emphasize more on objectives since they become stronger and are more important. So in the mid game, where you can sacrifice not being in fights because of some good XP and gold in the side lanes, you kinda need to be there more for your team in the late game. So if there's no imminent threat to your base in the sides, go death ball with your team. Let's go look at mid lane matchup tier list now. This is my personal mid lane matchup tier list. It shows 4 categories: impossible, hard, skill matchup and free. Left to right matters, so I would say Syndra is harder than Jon, for example. Tier lists like these are usually very personal, so this might not be the case for you. Difficulty can also vary depending if it's late game. For example, Silas in laning phase is pretty skill matchup, but once he goes late game it can be really hard. It also depends what elo you play at. This is in my elo, but in gold for example maybe Fizz or Zed would be higher on the list. But this is in general what I deem to be hard and what to be free matchups. Cassiopeia is the hardest counter. She melts you and you cannot really do anything against her, while she outscales you pretty hard. Other counters include champions that outrange you or are really mobile. The colored icons are the matchups where Phase Rush is an option. Everything else, I would typically just go Airy, but there are exceptions of course, depending on enemy team comp. For bans, I would recommend banning something you cannot play against. The champions I ban, for example, is Orianna or Syndra, but this is also because Orianna and Syndra are the two most picked high elo champions in mid lane, and they're both bad matchups for Swain. But this might not be the case for your elo, so ban what you truly find impossible to play against. The reason I don't ban Cassiopeia even though she's so hard is because she is very rarely played, so take play rate into account when banning a champion. For top, bans like Irelia, Jax, Olaf are really good bans as well. Bruisers that simply all in you are really hard in top lane. Meanwhile, basically all tanks are very easy matchups for Swain top. Best synergies for Swain are hyper carry junglers. Stuff like Graves, Viego, Kindred, Belveth. These work extremely well with Swain. Since he can frontline for them, take attention, make sure they can just deal out a ton of damage. His E is also really good at helping champs like Viego or Belveth get their reset off, because you can pull one person and then quickly focus them down. Kindred ultimate is really strong with Swain, and Graves' aggressive early game fits well with Swain as well. So if you have one of these 4 junglers, it's really important to play for jungle. For ADC, it's best to have hyper carries as well, stuff like Jinx, Cogmouth, Twitch, since they will be able to free hit when you stand in front of them. Having good synergy with support or top doesn't matter too much. And you can still easily win if you don't have hyper carries in both jungle or ADC. So don't focus too much on it. These are just the champs that synergizes best with Swain. Speaking of roles, this is how I think the roles compare to each other in terms of power. With mid and APC being similar in power, followed by top lane, and finally support as his weakest viable role. Swain jungle shouldn't be played if you want to climb, but everything except jungle is playable for climbing. So when is it good to pick Swain? Swain is best utilized against melee comps, where they cannot kite his ultimate, and he will be able to deal tons of damage to everyone around him. Countering enemy team comp is more important than having a good matchup yourself. So if enemy team has 4 or more low range champions, it's usually a really good Swain game. I'll give you an example of an enemy comp that Swain is really good into. This is a realistic comp you could meet in solo queue. Nautilus support, Kai'Sa ADC, Kiana mid, Gragas jungle, Zed top lane. Swain is really good into this comp because they are 4 melees, and their only range champ, which is Kai'Sa, isn't super long range anyways. I'll give an example of a really bad Swain draft. Milio, Jinx, Azir, Kindred, and Fiora. It would be complete suicide to pick Swain into this comp. It is very hard to stick to somebody, and they can just kite you for days with their superior range. Here is another example of a bad Swain draft, where Swain isn't a great choice. Even though it's a good matchup mid, the rest of the team simply counter me too much. Seriously try avoid picking him into ranged teams, unless you want to make it hard for yourself. I hope it's starting to make a little sense. So just summed up, range equals bad, melee equals good. There are of course always exceptions to the rules, because champs like Gwen or Fiora are really good into Swain because of their max health damage. But you get the point. Use common sense, guys. Now that you know when it's good to pick him, let's move into how to land more E's. My first big tip for landing more E's is casting it when the enemy laner goes for CS. Their movement will be easy to predict and they will be stuck in auto attack animation. This is one of the most consistent ways to land E's in laning phase. You can also change the direction of E by moving to one of the sides. If you follow your opponent's movement, sometimes you can hit an E by walking with them. This next trick is mostly used in lane. If the enemy opponent is standing close to their caster minions, you can sometimes hit them with the E explosion, something that I call E extend. People are usually caught off guard and they don't expect the range extension. Combining this trick with using E when they go for CS is really big and will land you way more E's. If you have ever played Ari before, you know how Q back and forth is easier to hit if you hit the enemy at max range. The same thing goes for Swain. So try and throw out E when the enemy is in max range. It will make it really hard for them to dodge it, compared to when they're close to you and they can just walk out of the returning E, which is very slow. The final tip for hitting more E's is throwing them out on carries in teamfights. Since what usually happens in teamfights is enemies' brains are too overloaded with information that they forget about dodging your E. Especially when you're frontlining, since they will feel the need to walk up, so you can hit some really clutch E's on important enemy targets, when their brain is focused on everything else than dodging your E. Let's talk about Swain W usage, his most versatile spell. Swain W is one of the spells in the game that has the most different uses. You can be extremely creative with it and it has a very high skill ceiling. I'll now go over the different uses of W. The most common use is of course in your own combos. When you pair it with an E, you can hit a guaranteed W. A really useful use of W though is blocking the enemy's path. Put it in front of the enemy towards where they are running. This will force them to either go around the W or run through it, getting hit and slowed. Use this trick to also help your teammates if they are chasing an enemy. Cut off the enemy's path and help your teammates secure a kill. Another really useful use Scouting the map. Since W gives vision on the area you use it on, check bushes, buffs, barons or dragons with the W. This is extremely useful late game when you want to see if they are on baron or not. You can also check and see if they are hiding in bushes trying to ambush your teammates. My personal favorite use of W is stopping the enemy's recalls. This can destroy their tempo completely, especially late game when you have very low cooldown on W. You can even stop bases multiple times in a row, and it's gonna get very frustrating for the enemy to play against. Most of the times people are looking in the shop so they won't even react, so you also get a free stack. Another way to get a free stack is by spawn camping the enemy. W takes 1.5 seconds to explode, so time it with their respawn timer. This will also remove their home guard, which will increase the time it takes for them to leave the base, giving you more time on the map to work with. In the late game it can also be very useful to use W to push side lanes. If you hit a neutral wave with a W, it will start pushing towards the enemy. This is really useful if you want to apply pressure to the enemy team from multiple lanes. This is also a cheat code if you want to catch waves inside, but you do not have the time to be there in person. You can kill the wave with a few W's from the other side of the map, so it doesn't pressure your base and you can be with your team. Now that we're talking about hitting minions with W, you should know W does reduce damage to minions, but it's still a great tool to finish off cannon minions that you would not be able to reach anyways. I do this a lot of the times when I base on a cannon wave. I just simply collect the cannon with the W. It's very easy to time, unless the cannon minion has taken damage, then it's gonna be hard. That is why it's so important to be really aware on Swain what's going on around the map, because you can be doing so much with your W, and helping teammates fight is also one of them. Try and combo your W long range with a teammate CC to make sure you land the slow and the damage. Even this little damage can sometimes turn a fight, and you will have saved your teammate. If a melee champ is jumping on top of you, you can also use your W on top of yourself to force them to walk back or take the damage and slow. But I think you get the point. Swain W has so many uses. So use your imagination and stop holding onto your W forever. As long as you don't have mana issues, you should use W every single time you can. This is the maxing order: max Q, W followed by E. Take points in ultimate every time you can. Start Q against melee champs and E against range champs. For melee matchups, I would also recommend putting 2 points in Q at level 3, since a lot of melee champs will be really hard to hit with W anyways, because many has dashes and therefore you can't reliably hit E. It's better to have reduced cooldown and more damage on Q. Against ranged matchups, you can take Q or W at level 2. It doesn't really matter too much, just pick what you're comfortable with. Let's take a look at some common Swain mistakes. Apart from building mistakes, these are some of the things I see goes wrong. Stop spamming your E and W in laning phase, especially before you get Lost Chapter or Catalyst. You need to be using Q way more. First of all, Q is a guaranteed hit. Meanwhile, E can easily be missed. The other big thing about using E all the time is it lowers your threat, because every time your E is on cooldown, the enemy can more safely walk up on you. Simply just holding your E and not using it threatens the enemy a lot, because he will always be scared of you throwing it out. So wait for more guaranteed higher percentage chance of hitting E's. Don't just roll your face on your keyboard whenever the enemy walks into your range. Simply hit him with a Q and be patient with your E. You really need to start using Q more for poke and not E. Q is insanely underrated, especially with Area and Scorch. This ties into another mistake I see often, and that is being way too passive in lane. This might be more of a general mid lane mistake, but I see so many players simply just handshake a lane where they should get a big lead. Don't just let the Kiana walk up and auto attack the wave. Keep Q spamming on her, auto attack her, keep harassing her. You're not a late game champion, you shouldn't handshake lanes. You need to push your advantage. Of course you will have lanes where it's not possible, but in those matchups that are good, you really need to try and get a lead. You are supposed to take over in the mid game. Talking about mid and late game, you need to be using your W way more. You're not gonna run out of mana at this point. Your W is on a spammable cooldown. You really need to utilize this ability to its maximum. Keep checking bushes, keep checking enemy jungle, help your teammates, push waves, last hit creeps. Actively use your W. There's no reason to hold the cooldown when it's only 10 seconds. You should be fishing for stacks all around the map. That is also why you need to be more map aware. Use your map way more than you currently are doing. You can't see the opportunities if you aren't looking. Now let's talk about the final common mistake that I see all the time, and that is people holding on to their R2 Demon Flare for way too long. Before the mid-scope rework, this ability used to do more damage the more you held it, but they removed that a long time ago. There's no reason not to use it. If 2, 3, 4 guys steps into your range, just use it, man. You probably won't get a better opportunity anyways. Just make sure you get the damage off at least. I see many people just holding it, and then suddenly all the enemies dash or flash out of your range, and then it's completely wasted. It would have been way better just to use the safe demon flare on 2 guys, making sure you get the damage and slow off, making it harder for them to escape, and trying to hold it for that glorious 5-man demon flare. I look at this ability as an AoE slow, so rather use it too soon than too late. And now for the most controversial part of the video, the skin tier list. I will say though, I feel like Swain has some really good skins, and none of them are particularly bad. So if I put your favorite skin too low, please don't attack me in the comments. This is just my opinion. Well guys, the guide is coming to a close. This is how I view Swain and how I would play him. This might be different from other Swain players. If you made it this far and learned at least one new thing about Swain, consider liking and subscribing. This will help out my channel. More guides like this will come in the future. For example, Season 14 itemization guide. I'll also make a video going over all the different mid lane matchups and how to play them. Hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.